Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. Today we're going to be talking about hand traps. This meta that we're in right now in Master Duel is pretty unique in that there are a ton of different hand traps that have a lot of really strong utility right now against the different decks of the meta. But there's really not any one hand trap that will cleanly solve all of your problems when it comes to going second against the current decks that are popular and strong right now. So I wanted to take today to talk about your options and what I think is particularly worthwhile and what I think will be a lot more popular not only now but also moving forward. If you're interested in catching helpful videos like this early, by the way, feel free to join as a YouTube member. If you do so, you get to see all uploads as soon as they go up, which is usually at least a day or two, but sometimes even up to a week before it actually goes live on YouTube. So if you're looking for more of these handy tips sooner, make sure to join as a member. You'll also get access to exclusive badges and emotes, and also get shouted out at the end of every video. Thanks to all of the people who are supporting through YouTube membership. Super appreciate it. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right on into this. So the first card I want to talk about today is Droll and Lockbird, which is been used quite a bit in the current metagame, as you've probably noticed. It's particularly good against MITSURUGI, which does a lot of searching, as well as Bystials, which is notorious for the same thing. Now, of course, the thing about Droll and Lockbird is that it works both ways. You can't do searches either, which means even if you're using it on turn 1, it can't necessarily be used in conjunction with like Maxi or Fuwalos all the time. Although sometimes you can do it if you draw it like later into your Maxi or Fuwa draws, after you've drawn a starter to stop your opponent's plays. But it's also worth noting that there are some strategies that can simply play around this with little problems. I mean, that's kind of the theme of a lot of these hand traps, right? So while Droll and Lockbird is particularly good against decks like MITSURUGI and Bystials, it doesn't have as much utility against decks like, say, Malice and Orcust, right? So Droll and Lockbird has been the most popular hand trap of choice. And indeed, I've been playing it as a 3-of in a lot of my early builds for this meta. Moving forward though, I think I might start to cut copies of Droll and Lockbirds from a lot of my decks in order to make room for some of these other hand traps. Particularly, I'm thinking about decks like MITSURUGI and Bystials that cannot play through Droll and Lockbird. So those are the kind of decks where I'm probably going to cut down to 2 or maybe even 1 copy of Droll and Lockbird just to have it as a target for cross-edge. However, when I think about playing a deck like Malice or Orcust, as mentioned, which can play through Droll and Lockbird very easily, there I'm still inclined to potentially play a full 3 copies. The reason for this being that if you can play through Droll and Lockbird, you can use it against your opponent's Maxi and Fuwalos, kind of as I mentioned before, right? Whereas if you're playing something like Bystials and you Droll yourself, like, yeah, your opponent's not gonna get any Maxi draws or Fuwalos draws, but then you can't continue your combo line. Whereas again, Malice or Orcust can just keep comboing through the Droll and Lockbird. So that's why I would consider playing 3 copies of Droll in decks like those, as opposed to something like Bystials or MITSURUGI. But if you have the room for it, you should just be playing as many Droll and Lockbirds as you can, I think. Because even against a deck like Malice, for example, right? If they start their turn with normal summon Chessy Cat and draw 2 and you Droll there, they won't be able to get their red ransom search, and that can very easily potentially lock them out of certain plays. It also will stop them from searching off of Wicked if they're playing it, and the Ignister, the backup at Ignister as well. That is to say, there are still some situations against these decks where Droll can definitely come up. One other thing that notably plays very well through the Droll and Lockbird is the Fiendsmith engine, right? So if you're playing a deck that's using Fiendsmith cards, you get hit with the Droll and Lockbird, and you cannot continue your deck's regular plays, you can simply always link into Moon of Closed Heaven. The only cards that Droll and Lockbird hits from the Fiendsmith engine is really just Engraver Searching Tract, right? Because then if they Droll you, you can't Tract for Larry because, well, that's a search. But again, that kind of doesn't really matter if you have 2 bodies just link into Moon of Closed Heaven and go full Fiendsmith combo anyway. That's why I think decks that are playing the Fiendsmith engine are particularly good right now. It's not even just a matter of like, oh, do you play MITSURUGI or Fiendsmith? If you're playing MITSURUGI and Fiendsmith in the same deck, then it should be a lot of the time very simple once you get hit with the Droll on your Mitsu engine to just pivot over to Fiendsmith. So if your deck has space for both engines to play around this, I would highly recommend doing so. All in all, I think Droll and Lockbird is very strong in this metagame, and like I said, I'd still be looking to play as many copies as possible in as many decks as possible, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk 3 of like I was treating it at the start of the meta, right? Next up, I want to talk a little bit about Artifact Lancea, a card that I haven't been giving as much respect as I should have been early on in the metagame. Of course, the level 1 thinking that I was engaging with was that, oh, the new pack with MITSURUGI is out, Malice just got a bunch of limits on the ban list, people are going to probably en masse drop Malice for MITSURUGI, therefore I should en masse across my decks drop Lancea for Droll. I think for maybe the first day or two of the new meta, that was a worthwhile strategy. But there's still plenty of people out there playing Malice, and of course Lancea is still a pretty solid turn-ender against that deck. But it is also pretty notably strong against Orcust as well. Remember that even though Orcust is a graveyard-focused deck, it activates all of its effects by banishing its cards out of the graveyard. Meaning if they can't banish, they can't use any of their graveyard-based effects. So you're already probably starting to see this dichotomy here, right? Where we have Droll and Lockbird, which is good against MITSURUGI and Bystials, but not Malice and Orcust. And then you have Lancea, which is really good against Malice and Orcust, but really doesn't do anything against Bystials or MITSURUGI. Now, that is to say there are some situations where you could still find use in Lancea in those matchups, most notably against Callby and Crossout. Now, here's the thing. I don't think that Callby and Crossout alone are worth maining Lancea. If those were the only cards I was looking to counter, I would not ever consider main decking Lancea. They're nice incidental things to hit alongside current decks in the meta, but I don't think they're the sole reason to play this card. That said, I don't know, it's interesting. Lancea does still hit a decent amount of decks out there that do incidental banishing. You know, I'm thinking about stuff like Crystron, for example. That's a deck that, while it's not very popular right now, was pretty notably hurt during Malice meta because so many people were on Lancea. Dragon Rulers, if you're looking for a more recent example, recent as in, you know, recently supported. Dragon Rulers, while not very popular, do critically rely on banishing to be able to summon any of their big monsters. So that's another deck that Lancea would incidentally be able to hit on top of the current meta. I will say Lancea I'm a little bit more curious about, particularly maining it in a deck like Malice or Orcust, because those decks do still want to do a lot of banishing on the opponent's turn when they're making plays on the opponent's turn. So you can't just automatically blanket use Lancea in any situation if you're playing one of those decks. So it's kind of, again, like the antithesis of Droll and Lockbird, where I'm looking to play 3 Drolls in a deck like Orcust or Malice that can easily push through it so I can use Droll against Maxi. Lancea, on the other hand, in a deck like Malice or Orcust, I'd be inclined to really only play 1 copy as a crossout designator target. And even then, I don't know that Lancea is quite popular enough to justify 1 copy as a crossout target, but of course you have to consider that we're not just playing 1 Lancea solely to use with crossout designator. It can of course also be utilized as a hand trap as well. Whereas again, we have decks like MITSURUGI or Bystials, where I feel much more safer in playing more copies of Lancea because I know it won't incidentally hurt me. That said, I don't know if I quite want to main 3 copies of Lancea in every single like MITSURUGI or Bystials deck moving forward, because it's still like a little bit dicey, you know? It's a little bit dicier than Droll when it comes to how useful or useless it can be in any given matchup. So all in all, I think I am going to be starting to introduce Lancea to my decks moving forward. But I think in a lot of decks, I'm not going to go for a full playset of 3. I actually think 2 might be fine. And even then, again, it's something like Malice or Orcust, I might even only go for 1 copy. But either way, if you haven't considered playing Lancea before now, you really should start. Because again, not only is Malice still arguably the best deck in the format, if not it's one of the best, but you still have Orcust, which is highly, highly rated out there as well. Now, If you are looking for a hand trap that has utility against Malice, Orcust, and Mitsurugi, I would say look no further than Bystial monsters. They are actually really good right now for those reasons. Now, the thing about Droll and Lancea is those are lingering effects that last for an entire turn, so as a result, they tend to be a lot stronger. Whereas a Bystial monster can really only banish, one light or dark. However, if timed well, this can be enough to either completely halt your opponent's turn moving forward or cause them to end on a much worse board. Against Mitsurugi, there is, of course, any number of the ritual monsters that you can banish as they're reviving themselves. Most notably, of course, is going to be Murakumo. If you use a Bystial monster to stop the Murakumo as it's reviving, you've not only prevented the board wipe, but also a negate/discard. So that's pretty strong right there. But there is also, of course, the fact that every Mitsurugi card is dark, so you're always going to have targets to use it against. Really, Night Sword Serpent is the only thing from the Mitsu engine that the Bystial cards wouldn't be able to hit. Fiendsmith, as I mentioned before, is still very prominent and still very good in the current metagame. You can, of course, use Bystial monsters to hit those. Orcust, again, that's a dark graveyard-focused deck. Pretty easy to see how Bystial is good there. Even Malice, you might think to yourself, well, but Bystials, banish cards. They are used as extenders in Malice. How could they be good against Malice? Well, actually, what you can do is you can use Magnum Hut against either Lake Decoder or just whatever card the Splash Mage is targeting. And in the right situation, that'll be enough to completely halt your opponent. Of course, you have to consider that Bystials aren't quite as good against Ryzeal. They might still have some use. Of course, Ryzeal does have light monsters, but I would say that Bystials are really not that great either in or against Ryzeal, right? Because in a Ryzeal deck, you're not really going to be able to use the Bystial card as, an extension for your plays because they're level 6, not level 4. Unless you're playing Mitsurugi and maybe you have some link options, but even then that's still a little bit situational. Whereas, Malice, Orcust, and Mitsurugi, these decks can just make use of a general body to link off. So I would say maybe not in Ryzeal decks, but in just about any other deck, if you are not currently right now, I would highly consider maining Bystial cards. At the very least, one Magnum Hut and one Juru Swarm, as they do have a lot of utility right now. Alright, wanted to talk at least a little bit about Nibiru the Primal Being. This is a card that you've probably been seeing quite a bit in the current metagame, but it's still it's used a little iffy right now. A lot of the reason you're seeing it a lot right now is because Mitsurugi can very easily make an incidental Gallant Granite to search it, so it's not hard to add a Nibiru to your end board in a lot of Mitsurugi decks. And for that reason alone, if you are making the incidental Gallant Granite and there's not another, different/better rank 4 or other monster you want to go into, then I actually think that alone is worth playing the Nibiru. It might not come up a lot in those kinds of situations, but it's still not bad to have. And let's be real, Nibiru is still not a bad hand trap overall, especially against more rogue decks. It's a very, very good card to find when you're deep drawing off of Maxi or Fua, because if you're deep drawing, that means your opponent is special summoning. Of course, Nibiru does have one notable drawback in this meta, particularly against Mitsurugi, and that is the fact that it tributes the monsters in order to summon them. As a result, of course, you will be triggering the Mitsurugi effects, which activate when they are tributed. But that doesn't necessarily make Nibiru completely useless against Mitsurugi, because for one, if they're pivoting into a different engine, you could still use Nibiru to stop that other engine. Yes, you'll still have to deal with the Mitsurugi monsters, but that's not as bad as dealing with that plus whatever else your opponent was going to do. Also, a lot of Mitsurugi lines will end up using the tribute effects throughout the course of the turn. This means that in a lot of situations, if you're just willing to be patient enough and let your opponent cycle through those tribute effects, your Nibiru could still potentially have some utility against those Mitsurugi builds. Now, of course, this card does have some other notable weaknesses in the meta right now. The same ones it had before, right? The fact that Malice and Ryzeal can pretty easily play around it with its inherent combo lines. Malice, if they open Dormouse, can make an Appaloosa early enough where Nibiru doesn't really matter, and of course Ryzeal has the field spell. Even Orcust, if they save their extenders, can still play through Nibiru a lot of the time, but even if not, At the very least, they'll still be able to revive Galatea I and have the face down crescendo, so if nothing else, they have a counter trap Omni Negate to kind of insulate their big token. Oh, speaking of tokens, by the way, and shout out to commenters here on YouTube for pointing this out, but this is something that I've mentioned a couple of times, but really a lesson that needs to be drilled home, because I still see people making this misplay. But if you are playing Mitsurugi and you have Murakumo on the field, sorry, let's reverse that. If you're playing against Mitsurugi and your opponent has Murakumo on the field, and you go to activate Nibiru and they activate Murakumo's effect, in a lot of situations, in almost every situation, you really should just be discarding the Nibiru. This is because if you discard the Nibiru, the effect to tribute all the monsters on the board will still go off, but the Nibiru won't be summoned. However, the Nibiru not being summoned also means the Primal Being token will not be summoned. Therefore, by discarding Nib, you lose out on the Nib body, but you also don't give your opponent a huge token. Of course, you also have the upside of not having to discard an additional card besides Nibiru for your Nibiru to board wipe. So again, I want to make sure that's clear for everybody. If you are activating Nibiru and your opponent chains Murakumo's effect, I would say 9 or even 9.5 times out of 10, you should just be discarding the Nibiru. Anyway, all that said, I still really like playing Nibiru, even in this meta. I think it has a lot of utility, and even if it isn't always useful against the top meta decks, it is still useful against them enough of the time that I generally think it's worth it, generally speaking. There are still some, you can still consider playing something like Droll or Lancea instead, if you're not maxing out on those copies, because in a lot of situations, those will actually have more impact than a Nibiru. That said, I really like Nibiru as kind of like a catch-all. It's one of the closest things you're going to get in a meta like this, and as mentioned before, it's also really good against a lot of rogue decks too. Dominus Impulse is not a hand trap that every deck can play. Of course, if you do activate it from hand, you cannot activate the effects of Light, Earth, and Wind monsters for the rest of the duel, but it is one that is very prominent in this meta, because, of course, Mitsurugi is all dark cards. It can naturally play this. Same with Malice, is all dark. It can naturally play this. Even Orcust, all dark. It can naturally play this. So you're going to be seeing a lot of it in this meta. And there is a legitimate question to be asked if you're playing one of these decks. Do I play Dominus Impulse or another engine? I think about that when I'm playing like Fiendsmith Mitsurugi, right? Like, the idea that I could cut the Fiendsmith engine and go back to pure Mitsurugi, and not only would it free up more space in the extra deck and also the main deck for off-meta techs, or for off-engine techs rather, but the most prominent of those off-engine techs would be Dominus Impulse. Now, Dominus Impulse isn't like a huge impact effect like Nibiru, nor is it a turn-wide effect like Droll or Lancea, but the ability to stop an effect that special summons is so targeted and highly impactful as a single negate that it still does end up being extremely good in this meta. Most notably, this can negate effects that don't necessarily activate on the field. So stuff that like Baylor or Imperm wouldn't be able to necessarily counter. And there's a ton of these, right? There's, any of the Orcust, like Harp Horror can stop the Mitsurugi special summons, like, pick any one of them, whether it's the Ritual Summon, the Revive, or the Habakiri effect. There's Ryzeal. Ryzeal, to be fair, is actually pretty good against Impulse. The only thing Impulse can really be used against there is Ice Ryzeal on the normal summon effect. But normal summon Ice Ryzeal is obviously a very common play, so it still ends up having a good bit of utility. It can also be used against plugin in some situations, but yeah, of course, the main thing holding Impulse back is, again, of course, the restriction of what kind of effects you can or can't activate. So that's going to be the main factor of determining whether or not you play this. And as mentioned before, it will also affect what engines you choose to play, what starters you choose to play. Again, going off the example of pure Mitsurugi, a lot of the time you would consider playing Lamia over Manju of the 10,000 hands because Manju is a light and, of course, conflicts with Dominus Impulse. But whether it's worth it to play Impulse or your additional engine is just, at the end of the day, hugely going to depend on what deck/engine you're playing. In the example of Mitsurugi, I think there's a solid argument either way. You could argue that playing Fiendsmith adds enough that it's worth not playing Impulse. You could argue that it's better to be stronger going second and that Impulse is better. At the end of the day, I do think this hand trap is very, very impactful and definitely will make you consider how you're building. I wanted to talk a little bit about Fuwalos as well. Fuwalos is a hand trap that I've actually been liking quite a bit in this metagame. I've seen a couple of people say that they don't think Fuwalos is very good right now because MITSURUGI doesn't do a ton of special summoning from the deck / extra deck, which of course is inherently true in the fact that they don't have extra deck monsters aside from maybe King of the Pharaoh Imps if you want to count that, but that's just to go from other off-engine into MITSURUGI. If you chain Fuwalos to like Habakiri, for example, yeah, you get a draw for the Habakiri effect, but the only other summon they really do from deck is the MITSURUGI ritual. So MITSURUGI, it's true, they can go full combo, only giving you 2 draws. But what is full MITSURUGI combo if you're only giving them 2 draws? It's basically just Murakumo and then a bunch of bodies that don't do anything on the board, right? And that's why I think Fuwalos is still really good in this metagame, is because if my opponent ends on Murakumo plus Habakiri and the Night Sword Serpent and whatever they brought back off prayers, all I really have to deal with at that point is Murakumo and maybe Great Purification. In the grand scheme of things, that's not that bad. I would much rather deal with that than also have them, link or Xyz off into whatever else they're going to go into with those extra bodies. So even though there is an argument that Fua isn't as impactful inherently against MITSURUGI as other decks, I do still think it is a really good hand trap. I think this is about as close as you're going to get to that sort of universally good hand trap, that midpoint between Droll and Lancea, where it's really high impact across all meta decks, right? Because naturally, of course, Ryzeal, Malice, Orcust, all these decks are going to be summoning a lot from the extra deck in most lines. Now, these decks also tend to have lines, or at least Ryzeal has lines, where they go just straight into a detonator and they kind of play around it, right? But I guess really like Malice, this does tend to be a lot more higher impact, where in certain hands they can make a Heart Cryptor pass and only give you 1 or 2 draws, but that is still going to be very hand-to-hand dependent. So all in all, I still really like Fuwalos right now. I can understand arguments against it. And of course, I don't know, I'm not necessarily looking to always main 3 Fuwalos before considering stuff like Lancea or Droll, but I think that Fua is worth a lot of consideration. Of course, the big drawback is you have to control no cards, so if you are playing other hand traps / engines that summon on your opponent's turn, maybe worth considering not playing Fua, but even then you could still just play a Fua before you use those effects, so I don't know, I tend to really like this card right now. Alright, so more than just the hand traps themselves, I did also want to talk a little bit about hand trap ratios in the current metagame, right? So when I'm building a deck, I tend to put in all of my engine first, just to see how many slots I have for hand traps. I've found that in most decks I've been building this season, which I'll just go ahead and show you, I've shown, I think, at least at one point, pretty much all of these on screen at some point, or if not, I have a video already lined up for them. But pretty much across all these decks, I've found that I tend to have room for anywhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 hand traps. I would say is about average for current Master Duel decks in this metagame. So when I'm considering the ratios and considering what to play, I always start with 2 Max C and 3 Ash. I think that's a pretty easy given, right? You're always going to be playing these. Max C is obviously the best hand trap, and Ash Blossom Counter is the best hand trap, and is also arguably the second best hand trap. So yeah, we're definitely using 5 of those slots for these cards right now, right? When it comes to my other 7 to 10 slots, it's going to be a little bit deck dependent, but here's kind of what I've been doing, right? So I like having the Fuwaloses. I don't always go for 3 before the other copies, but I would generally probably max out on Fuas and Droll before going for Lanceas, and then we do always appreciate an Nibiru. So right off the bat, if we do that and then we throw in 1 Imperm for a crossout target, I do like having 1 Imperm as a crossout target, even if I'm not dedicated to playing 3 of them. That sounds a little bit weird, but the strength that Imperm does have in this metagame right now, or not in this metagame, but in general, is that it can't be hit by Colonize. So I do like having the option to at least cross it out. I wouldn't go out of my way to do it, but if I was looking at a lineup like this and I have 1 more slot, yeah, I might throw in an Imp, right? But there are also other things to consider. Like, for example, this might be a solid hand trap lineup for, say, like a Ryziel deck, potentially. But if I'm playing, like, a, Malice deck, then I would definitely want the Bystial monsters. In a case like that, again, for something like Malice, I'm not really looking to Lancea all the time during my opponent's turn, but I still like it as a crossout target. And then maybe I might cut a Fuwalos in order to make for a couple of Bystial monsters. But of course, remember, Malice can also play the Dominus Impulse, so now we have to make further cuts. And at this point, I would probably consider, further going down on Fuwalos, maybe still keeping one as a crossout target, but even then you can make an argument to cutting it entirely, and then either putting out the Imperm, because Malice doesn't care about it, especially with the trap cards. You could make an argument for cutting the Nib if you are thinking that's not going to be high value enough for you. And something like Malice, I still really like the 3 Droll and Lockbirds, but if you're playing, a deck like Ryziel, for example, right, where we maybe have a little bit more room. Also, the Fuwalos being level 4 definitely helps Ryziel a lot more. Now, I would definitely, consider not playing the Bystials a lot more, throwing these back in. I think, yeah, this would probably be about my hand trap lineup for most Ryziel decks. I know I said you maybe would consider only playing 1 Droll and Lockbird, but honestly, it's still a good enough target that I like having 3. Again, the Lanceas, I don't know if I would necessarily max out on Lancea in this meta before I max out of like Droll and Lockbirds. I think having 2 is fine. Playing 2 of is kind of weird, right, when it comes to hand traps, because you can make an argument for 3, you want to see it all the time. You can make an argument for 1, I just want to cross it out, right? But 2 is a little bit weirder. So like a card that I'm playing 2 of, especially a hand trap, I'm thinking about how often I want to open it, right? And a card that is a 2 of, it's like, I don't necessarily want to see it in every opening hand, but I like having the option to have it. I don't know, ratios when it comes to hand traps, again, I think are quite interesting and do end up being pretty deck dependent, right? So yeah, that's just kind of like some quick examples of how I might build out hand traps for the current meta. But there's a ton of different ways that you can go about it. And there's, like I said, this meta in particular, it's basically, a lot of it comes down to Droll versus Lancea. What do you want to counter? How do you want to go about it? But let me know what you think in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, definitely let me know. I appreciate all feedback, but I think that's going to go ahead and do it for now. So let us move on to our outro. Hey everybody, Hexlex here. Thank you so very much for watching all the way to the very end of the video, which by the way is one of the best ways to support the channel. Speaking of supporting the channel, take a look at the names on screen. These are folks who have been so generous as to either join as a YouTube member or subscribe over on patreon.com/Hexlex to support. There's also perks for doing so. If you would like to see YouTube videos early, as well as some exclusive videos that get uploaded to YouTube, but for one reason or another I decide not to publish, definitely go ahead and hit that join button to see content early, as well as some exclusive content. If you're looking for more exclusive content, over on patreon.com, I upload exclusive videos that are not posted on YouTube just about every single day. Whether you choose to subscribe over on Patreon, join as a YouTube member, or simply continue to watch, your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so very much. But for now, this is Hexlex. I am signing out, and I hope that you have a fantastic day.